Well, for many years, lawyers and academics have argued about whether there is such a thing as sports law. And now that's become rather a sterile debate. Most recognise there is such a thing as sports law in the sense that there are sets of international binding codes with their own rules regulating such things as, for example, burdens and standards of proof, and having a universal system of sanctions. If you think of doping, for example, they often have their own system of tribunals and jurisprudence and their own independent regulators. And there are many associations of sports lawyers, specialist texts and journals, and academic courses devoted to sports law around the world. At the very least, it's become commonly accepted that sports law describes a thriving industry sector of legal activity. We have sports law specialists and departments in law firms, and the emergence now of specialist boutique sports law firms. I argue the same can now be said for football law. As with just about everything else, law follows the money. In the same way that the growth of international shipping and commerce fueled insurance, maritime and arbitral law, or the record industry, the growth of music and copyright law, the commercialization of sport has led to the growth of sports law. And football is, by a long shot, the most popular, the most played, the most watched, the richest and the most universal sports of them all. But it's also the unique nature of the football industry that has developed an international standard approach to such fundamental issues as the regulation of employment contracts. So the most significant commercial transactions in football usually involve the buying or selling of what's called player registrations, which is a commodity like no other that exists in society. As well as having employment contracts with players, clubs hold their registration right. That's a player's right to play in a league and thus earn his or her living. Those registrations are then traded, bought and sold between clubs, often for huge sums of money and often on an international market. And the way in which those registrations are entered and traded is subject to a strict set of international regulations, known as the FIFA regulations on the status and transfer of players, or RSTP. Essentially an international labour law specific for football. The transfer system has also spurred the growth of things like football agent activity, with the regulation of football agents also subject to universal international rules. And disputes that arise in relation to any of these and many other things are almost always subject to mandatory football-specific arbitration under a myriad of different arbitral tribunals, subject to the rules of various different regulators. So in England, for example, a commercial dispute between parties such as clubs, players or agents may be subject to arbitration under the rules of FIFA, with ultimate appeals to the Court of Arbitration in Sport in Lausanne, if it's of some international nature, or they may be subject to domestic arbitration under the rules of the English Football Association, or the Premier League, or the EFL, or the National League, depending on the nature of the dispute and the status of the parties. But virtually all will be subject to mandatory football arbitration. And outside of commercial disputes, a club will have various regulatory obligations to different football regulators concerning everything from bans on betting to complex rules about financial regulation and who is allowed to be an owner or a director of a football club. Take, for example, a club in the Premier League. It can have different regulatory obligations about how much it's allowed to spend according to UEFA, if it qualifies for a UEFA competition like the Champions League, and to the Premier League under the Premier League's own different profit and sustainability regulations. And of course, if that club gets relegated at the end of the season into the Championship, it then becomes subject to a different set of regulations, the EFL's Championship profit and sustainability regulations. And so you have different sets of regulations enforced in different ways by different regulators, but they all involve consideration of essentially the same thing: player contracts entered into by the club for money, that are usually entered into over a period of years, a period of seasons. So football is therefore a highly complex and specialist area of activity. Football law is a highly complex and specialist area of activity where disputes can be worth millions or tens of millions, and in some cases even hundreds of millions of pounds. And it's therefore little surprise that there are now increasing numbers of sports lawyers who work primarily or even exclusively in football. There's at least one book on football law and various international journals devoted to the subject. There are an increasing number of courses on sports law taught internationally that are focused primarily or exclusively on football. There's football-specific legislation, regulating stadia in the UK, for example. And there are football regulators, both national and international, who make rules, applying to all those involved in football, and which are in turn subject to the interpretation and challenge in football-specific tribunals. The other important thing to say about football law, or perhaps I should say the law as it relates to football, is that legal principles from an incredibly wide spectrum of law arise. So football law is both highly specialised and remarkably wide. It includes everything from the fundamental principles of commercial and contract law, trusts, fiduciary duties, and the law of agency, to employment law, discrimination and human rights, privacy and defamation, personal injury and intellectual property, sometimes criminal approaches to evidence, and commercial arbitration law, the conflicts between national and international systems of law, doping and regulatory law, tax law, European and competition law. I could go on, but you'll see there is hardly an aspect of law that does not arise in football. So whether or not you agree that football law exists as a distinct area of law, it certainly exists as a distinct area of practice. The practical need for lawyers with a specialist understanding of the issues specific to football exists, as does the need for football associations, clubs, owners, directors, players, agents and sponsors to have access to advice from and representation by lawyers with a comprehensive understanding of the legal issues arising in football.